But in this case, we have a new wrinkle. You remember that in the perfect forms, we had verbs like katal, transitive verbs, and we also had verbs like not kavav, but what? Kave. These were, we saw that stative verbs have a different vowel here in this second position. By the way, just in terms of terminology, I tend to call the vowel that occurs in this position the theme vowel. So if you hear me use that term, theme vowel, I simply mean the vowel that occurs under the middle root letter. Okay? Now what we have in the imperfect here in the case of natan is something similar. It's not a stative verb, but in the imperfect we find that some verbs just simply occur with different theme vowels. The standard vowel of long O, the O theme verbs, are by far the majority. But there are some verbs that simply have a different theme. In this case, natan is one of them. Natan is a verb which we would say is an E theme vowel verb. That is, it simply takes the form yitain. There's no real explanation for this. Obviously it's not because it's final nun or middle tau. It's simply that natan is an E theme verb. That it simply takes this E vowel here. And I realize that this is a bad way to start off the afternoon. But this should not really cause you problems in recognition. Look what we have in each of these cases. In yipol, the form that would be most normal here, we have a hirik under the preformative and a dagesh forte in the first root letter that's remaining. In yisa, we have the same thing. A hirik under the preformative, a dagesh forte indicating the nun that's assimilated. And in yitain, we have the same thing. So even though the theme vowel in each of these three forms is different, that shouldn't trouble you. You don't have to care about the theme vowel in this case. Okay? You can ignore it. All that matters is that you see you have the hirik, which is standard for the call imperfect under the preformative, and the dagesh forte in the first root letter that remains is telling you that a nun has dropped out. So for all practical purposes, you can ignore the variation in the theme vowels. Is that everybody with me so far on these? No questions? All right, let's move on then to natan. I want to take a little closer look at natan. This is a pretty common word in Hebrew. I want to spend just a minute with it because it has one other little problem besides the E theme that we were just speaking about. This is the full paradigm of natan and the imperfect. You can find, if you can't see it on the screen, it's in your textbook in the appendix. I think it's appendix 4F, if I remember correctly. But it is in the appendix in the back. No, I'm sorry, not 4F. Page 250. 4E. Okay, good. So if you can see that better, follow along here. The imperfect, we've seen the form yitain. So if we walk through these, yitain, titain, titain, titani, etain. Notice the segol under the aleph. Basically in the Hebrew verbal system, wherever you would put a hirik under an aleph, you substitute a segol. That's going to be a very consistent feature in Hebrew verbal forms as we move through them. So nothing there in the singular to cause you any problem once you understand where this form comes from. The plural, yittenu, no problem. And now we come to this form, titena. Okay? Now this looks even more peculiar. Notice that we have three letters with dageshes in them here in a row. Let's take a little closer look at this form. If we were going to write this out, substituting the original words, original letters for all these dageshes, we would up with the form pronounced the same, tintaina. But let's look at what's happened here. First, the nun in the first position has assimilated to the tau. That is, it has become a tau. That's normal for first nun verbs. Also, the final position nun now is closing the syllable and has a silent schwa beneath it. So what's going to happen to each of these letters? They're both going to do what? Yeah, they're both going to disappear and be written simply indicated with a dagesh forte. So in this final form we end up with, titena. How many of the original root letters are actually visible as it's written? Yeah, one. You've only got one root letter here to help you. Now, the nun in this form, the na, might help you a bit. But what you have to do when you see this form is look at the dageshes and say, what does each of these dageshes represent? You have to unpack this form in order to get it correct. Otherwise, you might look at it and say, that looks like a third-person feminine perfect ending. So could this be from a root tau, tau, nun, or something like that? This could be confusing to you. So you have to unpack these dageshes mentally to get this form right, to see what it is and how it evolved. So it's a problematic form, titena. The rest of the forms, titenu is perfectly normal here. The first nun's assimilated, nothing else has happened. And then we get in the second feminine plural the same form occurring again, just as it happens in the call perfect of katal, titena, and then nitain. So these two forms, third feminine plural and second feminine plural, have this added problem of both the first nun assimilating and the second nun assimilating. So the lesson is, as you look at these verbs, when you see a dagesh, the first thing you need to do is unpack that dagesh. You ask yourself, is it a dagesh lene or a dagesh forte? And then, if it's a dagesh forte, what is it? What has assimilated here? With me? Okay. Good. Now let's move on to our next little variation. The first nun verb, lakach. Now what's wrong with this? Lakach isn't a nun, right? There's no nun in lakach. How can we call this a first nun verb? Well, what happens is we would expect the imperfect form to be yilkach. The reason the pathox there is because this is third guttural, right? Just like yisa we saw a moment ago. So this is what a reasonable person would expect to find. It is not, however, what we get. The lamed assimilates to a kof and then is simply written as a dagesh lene. So we end up with the form yikak instead of yilkak. The lamed has assimilated. This is the only verb in Hebrew which does this. Unfortunately, it's a reasonably common verb, to take or to receive. So you'll look at this, you'll see the dagesh lene in the kof, you will say that's you'll see the dagesh in the kof, you'll say that's a dagesh forte because it's preceded by a vowel sound, can't be a dagesh lene. So I'm going to unpack it, and it must be a nun. So I'm going to look up nun kof chet and find there is no such verb, and then you're going to throw your hands up in despair and say, Professor Adams and Professor Bartelt have misled me, but that is not true. We have warned you that this happens with lakach. So as you learn this vocabulary word, think of it as a first nun verb. It's a first nun wannabe. Okay? Just have to learn it. No secret pattern here to figure out, just that lakach behaves as though it's a first nun. Notice you still get the same recognition point, however. You still have the hirik under the yod and the dagesh forte in the first root letter that shows. So you still know this is a call imperfect. It shows up the same way. You just have to unpack the kof correctly, or the dagesh correctly, into a